I'm Melanie Wilson, 27, and I just graduated from law school. The day I transferred my grandparents' $2 million estate into an irrevocable trust was the day my parents stopped speaking to me. That decision came after years of watching my father's gambling addiction destroy our family finances. I was their only child, but in that moment, I became the family traitor. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you want more stories about difficult family decisions and financial independence. My childhood began like a scene from a Hallmark movie. We lived in a cozy, three-bedroom house in a suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. White picket fence, basketball hoop in the driveway, and neighbors who brought casseroles when someone got sick. My dad, Richard, worked in sales, and my mom, Patricia, was an elementary school teacher. On paper, we were the perfect American family. My paternal grandparents, Harold and Eleanor Wilson, lived just 20 minutes away. I spent countless weekends with them walking through Grandma Eleanor's meticulously maintained garden while she taught me the names of all her flowers. Sunday dinners at their house were a tradition. Grandma would let me help bake cookies standing on a step stool to reach the counter, my small hands covered in flour as I giggled. Grandpa Harold would tell stories about his time in the Navy, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he laughed. The first signs that something wasn't right appeared when I was around 8 years old. Dad started missing important events. Mom would make excuses, he's working late or he got caught in traffic. I remember my second grade play. I had a small speaking role as a tree in our forest conservation production. I practiced my 3 lines for weeks. When I scanned the audience and saw only my mom sitting next to my grandparents, something inside me deflated. Dad had promised he'd be there. Later that night, I heard my parents arguing in their bedroom. Even with the door closed, their voices carried down the hallway. "It was just a friendly game, Patricia." "I'll win it back next time," my father insisted. "Richard, you said that last month. And the month before. Your daughter was looking for you in the audience tonight. I'll make it up to her. I'll take her for ice cream this weekend." He did take me for ice cream that weekend. He bought me a triple scoop with sprinkles and let me stay up late watching cartoons. That became the pattern-breaking promises, then making grand gestures to compensate. As I got older, Mom started picking up extra tutoring sessions after school. She said she enjoyed helping struggling students, but I later realized we needed the extra money. She became an expert at making excuses for Dad covering for his absences, explaining away the late notices from bill collectors. My grandparents noticed. I'd catch them exchanging concerned glances when Dad would show up late to family gatherings, smelling of cigarettes and cologne, his eyes slightly unfocused. But they tried not to interfere directly. Instead, they focused on me making sure I had everything I needed for school, taking me shopping for clothes when the seasons changed, encouraging my academic interests. When I was 10, I found Mom crying at the kitchen table, a pile of papers spread out in front of her. I asked what was wrong, and she quickly wiped her eyes, forcing a smile. "Just boring, grown-up stuff, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But I saw the red past due stamps on the envelopes before she gathered them up. Dad had a way with words. He could charm anyone, teachers, neighbors, even bill collectors. He made promises with such conviction that you couldn't help but believe him. "Things are going to change," he'd say. "I've got a big commission coming. This is the last time." And Mom wanted to believe him. We all did. Dad's sister, Aunt Margaret, was the only one who seemed to see through his charm. When she visited from Chicago, she'd have hushed conversations with Mom in the kitchen. Once I overheard her saying, "Patricia, you need to protect yourself and Melanie." Mom just shook her head and changed the subject. By 12, I had become the responsible one in the family. I helped Mom around the house, excelled in school, and learned to need less. When friends invited me to movies or the mall, I'd say I wasn't interested rather than admit we couldn't afford it. I started babysitting for neighbors to earn my own spending money. The summer before 7th grade, Dad promised a family vacation to Florida. Mom and I spent weeks planning. I checked out books from the library about marine life, excited to visit the ocean for the first time. 3 days before we were supposed to leave, Dad sat us down in the living room. "There's been a slight change of plans," he said, not quite meeting our eyes. "The trip needs to be postponed, just for a little while." Mom's face hardened. "What did you do, Richard?" "It's just temporary. I had an opportunity. The odds were in my favor, but—" "You gambled away our vacation money." Mom's voice was quiet, controlled, but I could feel her anger. Dad reached for her hand. She pulled away. "I'll make it up to you both. I promise." That night, after Dad left to clear his head, Mom came to my room. She sat on the edge of my bed and stroked my hair. "I'm sorry about Florida, honey." "It's okay, Mom," I said, though it wasn't. "We can go another time." She looked at me for a long moment. "You're growing up too fast, Melanie." Then she hugged me tightly and I felt her tears on my shoulder. That was the first time I truly understood that my father's problem wasn't just occasional bad luck or poor decision-making. It was something deeper, something that was slowly eroding the foundation of our family, and I was old enough now to see it clearly. High school brought a new level of awareness about my family's dysfunction. Most teenagers rebel against their parents' rules. I rebelled by creating structure where there was none keeping meticulous track of due dates, maintaining a perfect GPA, planning for college years in advance. Control became my coping mechanism. The incidents with Dad's gambling became more frequent and more severe. When I was 14, I came home from school to find Mom sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale. She'd just discovered that Dad had emptied their joint checking account, the one that held the mortgage payment due the next day. "He said it was a sure thing," she whispered. "He promised he'd double the money." Dad started borrowing money from extended family members. "Uncle Robert at Thanksgiving, I just need a small loan to get through the month." Cousin Sarah at her wedding, I hate to ask, but I'm in a bit of a jam. None of it was ever repaid. Eventually, family gatherings became tense affairs, with relatives making excuses to leave when Dad approached. My best friend Jason's family became my sanctuary. His parents, both accountants, maintained a home where bills were paid on time, dinner was on the table at 6:30 sharp, and college funds grew steadily in responsible investments. I spent as much time there as possible soaking in the normalcy. For my 16th birthday, Mom had been saving for months to throw me a small party. Nothing extravagant, just pizza and cake with friends at a local bowling alley. 3 days before the money disappeared from her dresser drawer, Dad swore he'd borrowed it for an investment opportunity that couldn't wait. The party was canceled. I told my friends I had the flu. That night, my grandfather called. "Melanie, your grandmother and I would like to take you to dinner for your birthday." They took me to a nice restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and multiple forks. After dessert, Grandpa handed me an envelope. "We've set up a small college fund for you," he explained. "Your grandmother and I will be the only ones with access until you're 18. I understood the implication. The money was being protected from my father. As my high school years progressed, my grandparents took a more active role in my life. They paid for my school expenses, new graphing, calculator, yearbook fees, prom dress. They never said it directly, but we all knew why. My relationship with my father became increasingly strained. His promises rang hollow. My mother's enabling behavior, making excuses, covering for his absences, working extra jobs to compensate for his losses, frustrated me. I loved her, but I couldn't understand why she stayed. When I suggested she leave him, she would say, "Marriage is for better or worse, Melanie. This is just a rough patch." A rough patch that had lasted my entire life. During my junior year, I discovered credit card statements in my mother's name for accounts she knew nothing about. Dad had opened credit cards using her information, maxed them out, and ignored the bills. Mom's credit score was in shambles. When confronted, he broke down, crying, promised to get help, swore it would never happen again. 2 weeks later, he was back at the casino. My high school graduation should have been a day of celebration. I was valedictorian heading to a prestigious university with a partial scholarship. The ceremony went perfectly until I spotted my father in the audience, his movements jerky, his eyes unfocused. He'd been gambling all night and had been drinking since morning. When I went to accept my diploma, he stood up and yelled, "That's my girl," slurring his words. People stared. My mother looked mortified. At the small reception afterward, my grandparents pulled me aside. Grandma held my hands in hers, her fingers cool and papery against my skin. "Melanie, we are so proud of you," she said. "You've accomplished so much despite difficult circumstances." Grandpa cleared his throat. "We want you to focus on your education. Don't worry about things at home." I knew what they weren't saying. Don't let your parents' problems become your problems. Don't get pulled into the quicksand. That fall, I left for college with a mix of emotions, excitement for my future relief at escaping the daily tension at home and guilt about leaving my mother to deal with Dad alone. As I hugged her goodbye in my dormitory, she whispered, "This is your time, honey. Don't look back." But even as she said it, I saw the worry in her eyes, the question she wouldn't ask, "Who will help me now?" College was like stepping into another dimension. Suddenly, I was surrounded by people whose biggest concerns were midterm grades or fraternity parties. No one was checking their phone, constantly afraid of what crisis might be unfolding at home. I threw myself into my studies, declaring a pre-law major. The structure and logic of the legal system appealed to me: clear rules, predictable outcomes, consequences for actions. My visits home became increasingly rare and brief. Each time the house seemed shabbier, my mother more tired, my father more distant. He'd recently lost his job in sales office politics, he claimed, though I suspected otherwise. Mom was now working full-time as a teacher, plus evenings at a local retail store. The refrigerator was often empty, save for condiments and expired milk. I started bringing groceries whenever I visited, using money from my campus job. In my junior year, I met Nathan Reed in a constitutional law seminar. He was thoughtful and stable, with a quiet confidence that I found magnetic. Our relationship progressed naturally without the drama I'd grown up witnessing between my parents. When he invited me home for Thanksgiving to meet his family, I was terrified. The Reeds lived in a beautiful colonial house in Connecticut. His father was a cardiothoracic surgeon, his mother a retired school principal. They had family game nights and inside jokes. No one checked their phone for casino winnings or hid bills in drawers. "Your family is so normal," I told Nathan afterward. He laughed. "I'm pretty sure that's the first time normal has been used as a compliment." "Trust me," I said, "normal is extraordinary." That winter, my grandmother Eleanor was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim, 3 to 6 months. I began making weekend trips home, taking the bus from campus on Friday afternoons and returning Sunday evenings. My grandfather looked lost, his tall frame suddenly stooped. My mother was overwhelmed trying to care for her mother-in-law while keeping her own household from collapsing. My father made appearances at the hospital, bringing flowers and making grand promises about taking care of everything, but would disappear for hours, his cell phone off. As Eleanor's condition deteriorated, she and I had conversations that we'd never had before. One afternoon, while my grandfather was meeting with the doctors, she patted the edge of her hospital bed. "Sit with me, Melanie," she said, her voice thin but determined. I perched carefully beside her, mindful of the IV tubes. "Your grandfather and I have been talking," she said, "about what happens after I'm gone." "Grandma, don't." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "No, we need to talk about this. Harold will need help. Not just emotional support, but practical help. Your father—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father has his struggles." "His addiction," I corrected gently. She nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face at not having to maintain the family fiction. "Yes, his addiction. We've tried to help him over the years, but we've come to accept that we can't fix it for him." Her eyes filled with tears. "But we worry about what will happen to everything we've worked for. Our savings, the house. We've built something to pass on, not just to the next generation, but beyond." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. "When the time comes," she continued, "promise me you'll be smart about the inheritance. Think long-term. Think about protection." I promised, not fully comprehending what she was asking, but recognizing the importance she placed on it. My grandmother died during finals week of my senior year. I rushed home for the funeral, numb with grief and exhaustion. The service was lovely. Eleanor had been active in her church and the community. The reception afterward, held at my grandparents' house, was another matter. I was in the kitchen, helping arrange food, when I overheard my father talking to my mother in the adjacent dining room. "The life insurance payout should be substantial," he was saying. "Once it comes through, we can finally get caught up. Maybe even take that trip to Italy you've always wanted." "Richard, your mother just died. This is hardly the time. I'm just being practical. Mom would want us to enjoy life." I stepped into the doorway. "That money is for Grandpa, to make sure he's taken care of now that Grandma's gone." My father turned, irritation flashing across his face before he composed it into grief. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm just looking at all the angles. That's what Dad needs right now, someone thinking clearly." The look my mother gave me clearly said, "Don't make a scene. Not today." In the months that followed, my grandfather became increasingly dependent on me for emotional support. We spoke on the phone several times a week. I helped him sort through Eleanor's belongings, gently encouraging him to donate what he didn't need. Together, we planted her favorite roses in the garden, a living memorial. Nathan was my rock during this period. He drove me to and from my grandfather's house, sat patiently while Grandpa told the same stories repeatedly, and never complained when our date nights were cut short by family emergencies. His steady presence made me realize how relationships could and should function. I graduated from college with honors that spring. As I stood in my cap and gown, scanning the audience, I saw my grandfather sitting beside Nathan, both beaming with pride. My mother sat a few rows back alone. Dad had claimed he'd be there, but as the ceremony began, his seat remained empty. Later, Mom would explain that he'd had car trouble, but the casino parking stub that fell from his pocket that evening told the real story. That summer, as I prepared for law school, I made a decision. I would specialize in trusts and estates law. My grandmother's words about protection and long-term thinking had taken root. I couldn't save my father from himself, but perhaps I could protect what my grandparents had worked so hard to build. Law school was even more demanding than I'd anticipated. Between classes, study groups, and my part-time job at a small estate planning firm, my days were packed from dawn until well past midnight. Still, I made time for weekly visits to my grandfather, who was adjusting to life alone in the large family home. My relationship with my parents continued to deteriorate. Dad's gambling had progressed to online poker and sports betting, giving him 24/7 access to his addiction. Mom had developed a perpetual nervous tic, checking her phone, constantly flinching when it rang. The few times I visited their house, I noticed past due notices on the counter, the heat turned down to save money, empty bottles in the recycling bin. One Saturday afternoon, I arrived at Grandpa's house to find my father's car in the driveway. Unusual, since Dad rarely visited his father unless he wanted something. Through the front window, I could see them in the living room, Dad gesturing emphatically while Grandpa sat stiffly in his armchair. I let myself in, quietly catching the tail end of their conversation. "It's just an advance, Dad," my father was saying, "against what would eventually come to me anyway. I've got a business opportunity that can't wait. I could double or even triple the investment." My grandfather's voice was firm. "No, Richard. I'm not funding another one of your opportunities. I've done that before, and we both know how it ends. You don't understand. This is different. I've got inside information." "What your father means," I interrupted, making my presence known, "is that he's planning to gamble with your money and has convinced himself that this time he'll win." Dad spun around, his face flushing. "This is a private conversation, Melanie. Adult business. I'm 24, Dad. That makes me an adult. And Grandpa deserves to know exactly what you're asking of him." Dad grabbed his keys from the coffee table. "I don't need this for my own daughter. Dad, think about what I said. I'll call you later." After he left, Grandpa sagged in his chair like a deflated balloon. "He's getting worse, isn't he?" I nodded, sitting in the spot my father had vacated. "Has he asked you for money before?" "More times than I can count." He rubbed his eyes behind his glasses. "Your grandmother was better at saying no to him. I always want to believe he's changed." A few days later, I received a call from Victoria Stevens, an established trusts and estates attorney who had been my grandmother's close friend. She invited me to lunch, explaining that my grandfather had reached out to her. Victoria was in her 60s, with silver hair cut in a sleek bob and the confident demeanor of someone used to handling complex situations. Over salads at an upscale restaurant near her office, she got straight to the point. "Your grandfather is concerned about the family estate," she said. "He's asked for my professional advice, but he's also asked that I include you in the conversation." "Me? But I'm still in law school. I don't have any expertise." "This isn't about expertise, Melanie. It's about trust. Harold trusts your judgment." The following weekend, I sat with Grandpa in his study as he revealed the full extent of his and Eleanor's estate. I was stunned by the figure, nearly $2 million in assets, including the house investments, retirement accounts, and some valuable collections. "Your grandmother and I were careful with money," he explained. "We both grew up during the Depression. We saved, invested wisely, lived below our means." He shuffled some papers on his desk. "We always planned to leave a legacy for our family. Not just for comfort, but for education, for security, for opportunities." He looked up at me, his blue eyes, so like my father's, clouded with worry. "I've seen what your father does with money. I love my son, but I'm not blind to his problems. Your grandmother and I worked our entire lives for this. It was meant to provide security for generations, not to disappear in casinos." The next day, Grandpa introduced me to his financial advisor, Martin Greenberg. Together, the three of us began preliminary discussions about an estate plan. Victoria joined our subsequent meetings, explaining various options for protecting assets while providing for family needs. I felt conflicted. On one hand, I was honored by my grandfather's trust. On the other, I was helping to create a plan that would effectively circumvent my father's access to inheritance, my own father. Was I betraying him, or was I honoring my grandparents' wishes and protecting their life's work? Around this time, my cousin Timothy began visiting Grandpa frequently. Timothy was my father's nephew from his older brother who had passed away years earlier. At 35, Timothy had never quite found his footing in life, bouncing between jobs and relationships. His sudden interest in Grandpa's well-being seemed suspicious, especially when he began asking questions about the will and offering to help manage Grandpa's investments. "He reminds me of your father at that age," Grandpa confided after one of Timothy's visits. "Full of big ideas and schemes, but nothing solid behind them." As we continued our estate planning discussions, Grandpa's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the gradual slowing of an elderly man. He tired more easily. His hands developed a slight tremor. He began to talk more about Eleanor, about their early years together, about how much he missed her. One evening after a meeting with Victoria, where we'd made significant progress on the estate plan, Grandpa asked me to stay for dinner. After we'd eaten, he disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small velvet box. "I want you to have this," he said, placing it in my hand. Inside was my grandmother's engagement ring, a modest diamond in a vintage setting, beautiful in its simplicity. "Grandpa, I can't. Eleanor wanted you to have it," she told me before she passed. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling just like they did when I was small. "That young man of yours, Nathan, is it? He seems like a good man. Steady. Responsible. The kind who would appreciate a ring with history." I threw my arms around his thin shoulders, inhaling the familiar scent of his aftershave. 2 weeks later, Nathan proposed during a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin. He had his own ring. He hadn't known about Grandma's, but when I showed it to him, he immediately understood its significance. We agreed I would wear his ring as my engagement ring and Eleanor's as my wedding band. When we called Grandpa to share the news, his joy was palpable even through the phone. "I wish I could dance at your wedding," he said, a note of wistfulness in his voice. "You will," I assured him. "We're thinking next summer. Plenty of time." But time wasn't on our side. 3 months later, I received a call from Grandpa's neighbor. She'd been checking on him daily, bringing him dinner and collecting his mail. That morning, when he didn't answer her knock, she used the spare key he'd given her. She found him in his bed peaceful as if he'd simply fallen asleep, and decided not to wake up. I sat beside his body in the quiet bedroom, holding his cool hand, overwhelmed by a sense of loss, but also profound gratitude. He had died peacefully in his own home, surrounded by photos of the long, full life he'd shared with Eleanor. In his final months, we'd had conversations that mattered. We'd made plans. We'd said the important things. And now I had responsibilities to fulfill. The funeral was held at the same church where we'd said goodbye to Grandma Eleanor just 2 years earlier. Many of the same people attended, commenting on how Harold and Eleanor had been inseparable in life and weren't apart for long in death. I found comfort in the thought. Throughout the service, I was acutely aware of my father's restlessness. He checked his watch, repeatedly shifted in his seat, whispered to my mother. While I stood receiving condolences in the church vestibule, I overheard him asking the funeral director when the reading of the will would take place. The reading was scheduled for the following day at Victoria's office. I arrived early, having barely slept. Nathan came with me for moral support, but waited in the reception area, understanding that this was family business. Victoria's conference room felt too warm, too small for the tensions it contained. My parents sat across from me, Dad leaning forward in his chair, Mom clutching her purse in her lap. Timothy slouched in a corner seat, attempting to look casual but watching Victoria's every move. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Kenneth, who had flown in from Chicago, sat beside me, Margaret occasionally patting my hand reassuringly. Victoria began with the standard legal preamble, then got to the heart of the matter. The entirety of Harold Wilson's estate, with the exception of specific personal items noted in the addendum, is bequeathed to his granddaughter Melanie Wilson. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. "That's impossible," my father finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Mr. Wilson," Victoria replied, sliding a document across the table. "Your father was very clear about his wishes. He's also left a letter explaining his decision. The letter was addressed to the family but focused primarily on me. In it, Grandpa explained his and Grandma's concerns about my father's financial judgment, their desire to protect the family assets, and their confidence in my ability to manage the inheritance responsibly. The letter was firm but kind, expressing love for his son while acknowledging his limitations. Dad pushed back from the table so violently his chair tipped over. "This is your doing," he hissed at me. "You manipulated an old man." Turned him against his own son. Richard Victoria interjected. "I can assure you that Harold was of sound mind when he made these decisions. In fact, we began the estate planning process nearly 18 months ago. Convenient timing," Timothy chimed in. "Right when Melanie started visiting more frequently." "I was visiting because Grandma was dying, you jackass," I snapped, immediately regretting my loss of composure. Mom reached for Dad's arm. "Richard, please sit down. Let's discuss this like adults." "What's to discuss? My father disinherited me in favor of my daughter. His own son," he turned to me, eyes blazing. "I hope you're satisfied. I hope whatever game you were playing was worth destroying this family." Aunt Margaret stood up. "The family was already damaged, Richard, and not by Melanie. Your parents watched you squander every opportunity, every loan, every second chance. They made this decision to protect what they built, not to punish you." Dad stormed out with Timothy close behind. Mom hesitated, torn between following her husband and staying to understand the details. Finally, with an apologetic glance at me, she hurried after Dad. In the days that followed, the situation escalated. Dad left voicemails demanding, "I do the right thing and split the inheritance." Mom sent text messages alternating between guilt trips and pleas for understanding. Timothy began spreading rumors among extended family that I had manipulated Grandpa when his mental faculties were declining. Then came the bombshell. Dad showed up at my apartment one evening, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes rumpled. "I need your help, Melanie," he said without preamble. "I'm in trouble. Real trouble." He proceeded to reveal the extent of his gambling debts, over $300,000 owed to various creditors, including $75,000 to a loan shark named Frank Moretti, who was not known for his patience. "They're threatening to take the house," he said. "Your mother could be homeless. Is that what you want?" "You're trying to manipulate me," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Using Mom as leverage." "It's not manipulation if it's the truth," he shouted. "We're about to lose everything, and you're sitting on a fortune that should have been shared with the family." Nathan, who had been in the bedroom giving us privacy, appeared in the doorway. "I think it's time for you to leave Richard." Dad looked from Nathan to me, his expression hardening. "So, that's how it is. You've replaced your family with him." "My family consists of people who respect boundaries and don't try to use me to fund their addictions," I replied. After he left, I called Victoria. We set up an emergency meeting with a financial advisor specializing in addiction scenarios. Together, they helped me understand my options and legal obligations. I was not, as it turned out, required to bail out my father from self-inflicted financial disasters. The situation grew more concerning when I learned about Dad's connections to Frank Moretti. A quick online search revealed several news articles about Moretti's loan shark operations and his methods of debt collection. Victoria suggested I document all interactions with my father and consider a restraining order if necessary. That necessity came sooner than expected. One night, Dad and Timothy showed up at my apartment, clearly intoxicated. They pounded on the door, shouting that they knew I was home. When I refused to let them in, Dad threatened to expose me to the entire family to contest the will on grounds of mental incompetence, to make my life a living hell until I fixed what I had done. The next morning, I discovered my car had been vandalized, deep scratches along both sides, a broken taillight, and the word thief scratched into the hood. There was no proof it was Dad or Timothy, but the timing was suspicious. Nathan insisted I stay with his parents until things calmed down. I finished law school despite the family drama, graduating with honors. The day I passed the bar exam should have been one of the happiest of my life. Instead, I spent it consulting with Victoria about protection orders and trust structures, my cell phone turned off to avoid the barrage of messages from my parents. The final straw came when Mom called from a number I didn't recognize, bypassing my blocks. "Your father owes dangerous people money, Melanie," she said, her voice trembling. "They came to the house yesterday. They said next time they won't be so polite. Mom, I can help you get out. I can find you a safe place to stay. But I can't keep enabling Dad's addiction. He's your father. Family helps family. Then why won't you let me help you the way you actually need, away from him?" The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't leaving him no matter what. That night, lying awake beside a sleeping Nathan, I made my decision. I would protect my grandparents' legacy exactly as they had asked me to. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of respect for their wishes and the recognition that sometimes protection means saying no to those we love. Victoria and I spent weeks designing the perfect trust structure. We created an irrevocable trust that would protect the assets while still fulfilling my grandparents' wishes to support family, education, healthcare, and stability. The trust included provisions for educational expenses for future generations, assistance with medical emergencies, and help with first-time home purchases, the kinds of financial boosts that create opportunity without enabling dependency. I included small provisions for my parents' basic needs, accessible only through the trustee, not directly to them, ensuring that my mother would never be homeless or without health care regardless of my father's financial decisions. The principal would remain protected with myself and eventually my children serving as trustees. The day we finalized the paperwork was surreal. I sat in Victoria's office signing document after document, each signature cementing my commitment to my grandparents' vision. The process was technical and complex, but underneath the legal jargon was a simple truth. I was creating a firewall between addiction and generational wealth. When I told Nathan what I'd done, he pulled me into a tight embrace. "You've made the hardest choice possible," he said. "But it's the right one. Then why does it feel so awful? Because you're a good person who loves her family, even when they make it difficult." Telling my parents was the next hurdle. After consulting with Victoria, I arranged to meet them at a coffee shop, public enough to discourage a scene but private enough for a difficult conversation. I arrived early, choosing a corner table and ordering a chamomile tea I had no intention of drinking. They arrived together, Mom looking smaller than I remembered Dad, wearing the forced cheerfulness that usually meant he was suppressing anger. They ordered coffees and made awkward small talk about the weather before Dad cleared his throat. "So, Melanie, your mother and I have been thinking. We know things have been tense lately, but we're family. And we think it's time to put all this inheritance business behind us and move forward together." I took a deep breath. "That's actually why I wanted to meet. I've made some decisions about Grandpa and Grandma's estate." I explained the trust structure as clearly and compassionately as possible, emphasizing the provisions I'd included for their basic security. With each sentence, my father's expression darkened. "An irrevocable trust," he repeated when I finished. "So you've put the money where I can never touch it." "Where it's protected," I corrected. "For education, for healthcare, for future generations, exactly what Grandpa and Grandma wanted." "You had no right," Mom interjected, her voice quavering. "That money should have been shared with the family. With us. The money is for the family," I insisted. "Just not in the way Dad wants to use it." Dad slammed his hand on the table, causing nearby patrons to turn and stare. "You think you're so smart with your law degree and your fancy trust. You think you know what's best for everyone. You're nothing but a self-righteous little—" "That's enough," Richard, Mom cut in. "Not here." He stood abruptly. "I have nothing more to say to you, Melanie. You've made your choice. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer our daughter." Mom looked torn, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment, I thought she might stay, might finally choose me over him. Instead, she gathered her purse and stood. "You were our only child," she said softly. "How could you do this to us?" They left without looking back. I sat alone at the table for a long time, my untouched tea growing cold, wondering if I'd just orphaned myself. The following weeks were a blur of conflicting emotions. I met with Aunt Margaret and Uncle Kenneth to explain my decision. To my surprise, they were supportive. "We've been giving Richard and Patricia money for years," Margaret admitted, "paying their property taxes when they fell behind, covering emergency car repairs, even helping with groceries sometimes. It never fixes anything. It just disappears into the black hole of his addiction." Timothy's campaign against me intensified. He called distant relatives, old family, friends, even my former classmates, spreading a narrative that I'd manipulated my grandfather and stolen the family inheritance. Some believed him. I received angry emails from cousins I barely knew accusing me of elder abuse and greed. Then the threats began. First, voicemails from unfamiliar numbers, men with gruff voices asking when Richie Wilson was going to pay what he owed. Then a visit to my office from a man who claimed to be an associate of Frank Moretti, suggesting that my father's debts could become my problem if I didn't do the right thing. The police were sympathetic but limited in what they could do. I filed for a restraining order against my father after he vandalized my car a second time, this time caught on my apartment building's security camera. The judge granted it, but the piece of paper felt flimsy protection against the storm I'd unleashed. The final blow came when Nathan and I began wedding planning. I sent my mother a text asking if she would consider being part of the ceremony despite our differences. Her response was brief. "I can't celebrate with a daughter who destroyed her father." I blocked her number after that, unable to bear any more rejection. One evening, overwhelmed by the isolation, I broke down on the phone with Rebecca, my closest friend from law school. "I've lost my entire family," I sobbed. "Maybe I should have just given them some of the money. Maybe I could have helped Dad get treatment set conditions." Rebecca said firmly, "You did what your grandparents asked you to do. What any addiction specialist would tell you to do. You can't buy someone out of addiction. Your father has to want to change." Nathan's parents stepped in where mine had failed. His mother helped me shop for a wedding dress his father offered to walk me down the aisle. They included me in family holidays, never treating me as an outsider. Their kindness was a lifeline, but it couldn't completely fill the void left by my parents' absence. The hardest part was the silence. After years of chaos, of constant crisis management, suddenly there was nothing. No late-night emergency calls, no bailout requests, no fires to put out. Just the vast, echoing absence of the people who had been the center of my world, however dysfunctional that world had been. I threw myself into my new career at Brennan and Associates, a mid-sized firm specializing in estate planning. The work was demanding but fulfilling, helping families protect their assets and plan for the future much as I had done for my own family. Victoria had recommended me for the position and continued to serve as a mentor both professionally and personally. But success in my career couldn't compensate for the gaping hole in my personal life. I began having panic attacks, heart racing, unable to catch my breath, convinced I was dying. A concerned Nathan finally persuaded me to see a therapist. Dr. Larson specialized in family trauma and addiction issues. In our first session, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. "When did you first become responsible for your parents' well-being?" I couldn't answer. I'd been my mother's protector, my father's conscience for as long as I could remember. "Doctor?" Larson helped me see how those roles had shaped me, my perfectionism, my need for control, my difficulty accepting help from others. We began the slow, painful work of unraveling these patterns and establishing healthier ones. Wedding planning continued against this backdrop of therapy and self-discovery. I had dreamed of a large ceremony with extended family, but with half the guest list now estranged, we opted for a smaller, more intimate affair. Aunt Margaret offered to stand in for my mother to help me prepare on the morning of the wedding and to represent my family during the ceremony. A week before the wedding, I made one final attempt at reconciliation. I drove to my parents' house, my heart pounding as I approached the familiar front door. The yard was unkempt, the paint peeling signs of continuing financial struggle despite the trust provisions I'd established for their basic needs. Mom answered the door, her surprise quickly masked by wariness. She had lost weight, dark circles under her eyes, aging her beyond her 54 years. "Melanie, what are you doing here?" "I'm getting married next Saturday," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd like you to be there. Both of you." She glanced over her shoulder into the house. "Your father isn't home. Will you come? Even if he doesn't." Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't choose between my husband and my daughter." "But you already have, Mom. Every time." She shook her head. "That's not fair." "None of this is fair, but it's the reality we're living in." I reached into my bag and pulled out a wedding invitation. "If you change your mind, the details are all here." She didn't take it, so I placed it on the small table beside the door. "I love you, Mom. That hasn't changed." She closed the door without responding. Neither of my parents attended the wedding. We left 2 empty seats in the front row anyway, a testament to absence, to loss, to hope, not quite extinguished. The ceremony was beautiful despite their absence. Nathan's father walked me down the aisle. Aunt Margaret adjusted my veil before the procession began. Rebecca gave a heartfelt toast at the reception. We danced and laughed and celebrated, and if there was a bittersweet edge to the joy, it only made it more precious. We used the trust funds exactly as intended. We purchased a modest first home in a good school district, established a robust emergency fund, and set aside money for future children's education. Nathan, as a financial advisor, understood and respected the boundaries around the trust. "This isn't our money to spend frivolously," he would say. "It's a responsibility we're stewarding." Through Aunt Margaret, I occasionally received news about my parents. They had lost the family home, unable to maintain the mortgage payments despite the trust provisions that would have covered them had they cooperated with the trustee. They moved to a small apartment across town. Dad was working sporadically as a car salesman. Mom had taken early retirement from teaching due to health issues. The news always left me with a confusing mix of emotions: sadness for their struggles, guilt over my comfortable life, but also a stubborn certainty that giving them direct access to the trust would have only postponed the inevitable, while depleting resources meant to last generations. 6 months after the wedding, I had a chance encounter with my mother at the grocery store. I rounded the corner of the cereal aisle, and there she was comparing prices on store brands. Our eyes met. For a moment, I thought she might speak to me. Instead, she abandoned her half-filled cart and walked out of the store. I called Dr. Larson from the parking lot, sobbing so hard I could barely speak. She wouldn't even look at me, I kept repeating. Her own daughter. "Your mother is caught in the same addiction cycle as your father," Dr. Larson reminded me gently. "Her addiction is to him, to the enabling role. Until she's ready to break that cycle, these encounters will be painful." With Nathan's encouragement, I joined a support group for adult children of addicts. Sitting in a circle with others who understood the peculiar grief of loving someone who consistently chooses their addiction over you was transformative. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in my experience. Victoria continued to be a source of wisdom and support. "Your grandparents saw something special in you," she told me over lunch one day. "Not just intelligence or responsibility, but moral courage. The willingness to make difficult choices for the right reasons. That's rare, Melanie." Gradually, I learned to set boundaries without crushing guilt. I focused on building the life I wanted with Nathan, on nurturing healthy relationships with friends and extended family, on finding meaning in my work, helping other families navigate complex financial decisions. Our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, we hosted dinner for Nathan's family, Aunt Margaret, and Uncle Kenneth, and a few close friends. As we sat around the table sharing what we were grateful for, I realized we were creating new traditions, a new kind of family built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation and dysfunction. That evening, after everyone had left and Nathan and I were cleaning up, the doorbell rang. On the porch was a small package with no return address. Inside was a Christmas ornament I recognized from my childhood, a ceramic angel. My mother and I had painted together at a community art class when I was 9. Wrapped with it was a note in my mother's handwriting: "Some traditions deserve to continue." There was no reconciliation message, no invitation to reconnect, just this small acknowledgement of our shared history. It wasn't everything, but it was something, a tiny crack in the wall between us. A week later, I received a letter from a rehabilitation facility 2 states away. My father had checked himself in for a 90-day treatment program. The letter part of his 12-step process didn't ask for forgiveness or money. It simply acknowledged the pain his addiction had caused and his commitment to recovery. It was the first time in my life I could remember him taking genuine responsibility for his actions. 1 year after creating the trust, I sat in Victoria's office for our annual review. The investments were performing well. The legal structures were holding firm. On paper, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "How are you doing with all of this?" Melanie Victoria asked after we'd reviewed the financial details. Not as the trustee, but as a person. I considered the question carefully. "I'm at peace with the decision," I said finally. "I still have moments of doubt, moments when I miss my parents so much it physically hurts. But I know I honored what my grandparents wanted. I protected their legacy." Victoria nodded. "That's all any of us can do: make the best decisions we can with the information we have, then find a way to live with those decisions." My career was flourishing. I had developed a specialty working with families affected by addiction, helping them create financial structures that provided support without enabling destructive behaviors. My personal experience gave me insight and empathy that textbooks couldn't teach. The most unexpected development came 6 months after my father entered rehab. He completed the 90-day program and continued with outpatient treatment, maintaining his sobriety for half a year, the longest period of abstinence in his adult life. He requested a meeting through his counselor. We met at a neutral location, a park halfway between our homes. He looked different, thinner somehow, both older and younger simultaneously. The constant tension that had characterized his expression was gone. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said after we'd exchanged awkward greetings, "or to pressure you about the trust. I just wanted to say face to face that I'm sorry. I'd imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was happening, I didn't know how to respond." "Your grandparents were right," he continued when I remained silent. "I would have squandered everything. I was so deep in my addiction that no amount would have been enough." He looked down at his hands. "I resented them for seeing it. I resented you for accepting it. But now, with some clarity, I understand." "How's Mom?" I asked, unable to address his apology directly. "Struggling," he admitted. "She's angry about my recovery, if you can believe it. The counselor says it's because our dynamic is changing and she doesn't know who she is if she's not taking care of me. Will she ever forgive me?" I couldn't keep the yearning from my voice. "I don't know, Melanie. She sees the trust as a betrayal, not as protection. Maybe someday she'll understand." He paused. "But my forgiveness, my understanding, you have that for whatever it's worth." It was worth more than I could express. We didn't reconcile completely that day. There was too much history, too much pain on both sides. But we established a fragile connection, occasional texts, brief phone calls on holidays, a tentative acknowledgement that we were still family despite everything. My mother remained resistant. When I sent her a card announcing my pregnancy, she didn't respond. But on the day Benjamin Harold Wilson was born, a small package arrived at the hospital, a hand-knitted baby blanket with no note. It was something. A thread not completely severed. The trust operated exactly as intended. My cousin Lisa received assistance for graduate school tuition. Uncle Kenneth's cancer treatment was partially covered when his insurance denied a specialized procedure. Nathan's brother and his wife used the first-time homebuyer provision to help with their down payment. These were the kinds of financial boosts that opened doors without creating dependency, exactly what my grandparents had envisioned. Benjamin's birth gave me a deeper appreciation for my grandparents' perspective. Looking at my son, I understood viscerally the desire to protect and provide, not just for the present, but for the future. The weight of being a generational steward no longer felt like a burden, but a privilege. As Benjamin grew, I found myself telling him stories about his great-grandparents, Eleanor's garden, Harold's naval adventures, their wisdom and foresight. I showed him photographs, preserved their traditions, kept their values alive in our home. The inheritance wasn't just financial. It was a legacy of values of responsibility, of love, expressed through protection and foresight. My father maintained his sobriety, an ongoing process of daily choices and constant vigilance. Our relationship remained cautious but gradually warming. He visited occasionally, always sober, always respectful of our boundaries. He was getting to know his grandson in small, supervised interactions. It wasn't the relationship I had dreamed of as a child, but it was honest in a way our family had never been before. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this was that sometimes the most loving choice is also the hardest one. Sometimes love looks like saying no. Sometimes protection requires distance. Sometimes healing begins only after you stop trying to fix what's broken and focus instead on building something new. Looking back at the decision to transfer my grandparents' estate into an irrevocable trust, I recognize it as a turning point, the moment I stopped perpetuating cycles of enablement and began creating a new financial legacy for future generations. It cost me dearly in the short term, but the long-term benefits, not just financial but emotional and relational, have proven its wisdom. To anyone facing similar difficult family financial decisions, I would say this: you cannot heal someone else's wounds by allowing them to injure you. You cannot save someone from their addiction by funding it. True love sometimes requires making the unpopular choice, standing alone, being misunderstood. But with time, with perspective, with healing, the right decision reveals itself in the stability and security it creates. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever had to make a difficult financial decision that affected your family relationships? How did you handle it? Please share in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes the hardest choices are also the right ones. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you wisdom and courage in your own.